In the early morning darkness of June 4, 1942, Japanese pilots waited aboard 4 aircraft carriers. Some sat in their cockpits breathing in the Pacific air, others studied target maps for the last time in briefing rooms, while deck crews and mechanics rushed to finish last-minute work on the planes. None of them knew that just 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American carriers were already preparing to launch their own attack. Within hours, what Japan hoped would be a decisive victory, wiping out U.S. carrier power, would instead turn into the Empire's greatest naval disaster. The same 4 carriers that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor would be destroyed, dragging over 3,000 sailors and airmen down with them. With those losses went not only ships and fuel, but also Japan's hopes for expansion. 6 months of victories would come to an end. For the first time, this turning point in the Pacific War is told from the perspective of those who lost it, the admirals who planned it, the pilots who flew it, and the sailors who paid with their lives. This was the Battle of Midway. The story begins in the spring of 1942, 2 months before the defeat at Midway. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was locked in arguments with the naval general staff. Publicly, Japan seemed unstoppable. Privately, Yamamoto knew otherwise. The December attack on Pearl Harbor, though daring and brilliantly executed, had failed in one critical way. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been destroyed. The USS Enterprise and USS Lexington had been out at sea during the raid, and for 6 months since, U.S. carriers had continued striking Japanese positions across the Pacific. Then came April 18th. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the USS Hornet, appeared over Tokyo in what became known as the Doolittle Raid. It caused little physical destruction but delivered a devastating psychological blow. The Japanese homeland had been exposed, and the military leadership had promised that could never happen. Someone had to be held responsible. Vice Admiral Chuichi. Nagumo, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack, was under particular pressure. He had been blamed for not launching a third wave at Pearl Harbor and for failing to locate the U.S. carriers. Now Tokyo itself had been bombed under his watch. The demand for a decisive action grew stronger. But within Japan's high command, 2 different strategies clashed. The Naval General Staff pushed for a conservative approach, consolidating gains in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, cutting off supply lines between America and Australia. Yamamoto, however, had another plan, one driven by urgency. He understood something many of his peers did not. Japan was racing against time. Yamamoto had lived and studied in the United States, first at Harvard and later as a naval attaché. He had seen America's industrial power up close: steel mills in Pittsburgh, shipyards in Newport News, vast farms able to feed millions of workers. He knew that once U.S. industry reached full production, Japan could never match its output. He openly admitted this before the war. In 1940, he told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, "If we are ordered to fight, I can promise to hold out strongly for the first 6 months, but after 2 or 3 years I have no confidence." In September 1941, he warned again, "For a while we will have our way everywhere, stretching out like an octopus, but it will last a year and a half at most." Both predictions proved accurate. Yamamoto's answer was Operation MI, the invasion of Midway. Just 6 square miles of coral and sand, Midway's value lay not in size but in location. Sitting 100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, it was America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. It provided fuel and resupply for submarines and aircraft, but more importantly, Yamamoto saw it as bait. He believed the U.S. would not allow Midway to fall. When the American carriers came to defend it, Japan's larger fleet would destroy them in a decisive showdown, the Kantai-Kessen, the climactic fleet battle Japan's naval strategy had always sought. But the plan was ambitious to the point of danger. It required multiple fleets to operate over thousands of miles. The invasion force would seize Midway. The carrier strike force would crush U.S. air power. The main battle fleet, including Yamamoto's flagship, the super battleship Yamato, would then finish off any survivors. At the same time, another Japanese force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to draw U.S. attention north. In total, nearly 200 ships took part, the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. The operations orders filled 700 pages and were only distributed days before departure, leaving little time for commanders to prepare. Opposition existed, but it was ignored. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, oversaw war games in May that produced troubling results. In the exercises, American carriers appeared sooner than expected and inflicted heavy losses. Instead of accepting the outcome, umpires reduced the damage and allowed sunk Japanese ships to re-enter the game. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, who had masterminded the Pearl Harbor strike, also raised concerns about the plan's complexity and the carrier's vulnerability. He too was brushed aside. Japan was suffering from what officers themselves called victory disease, the dangerous overconfidence bred from months of success. The overconfidence extended to intelligence. After the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, Japan believed it had destroyed two U.S. carriers. In reality, only the USS Lexington had been sunk. The USS Yorktown, though badly damaged, was rapidly repaired at Pearl Harbor. Over 1,400 American workers restored the ship in just 3 days, a pace Japan could not have matched. Japanese planners assumed only 2 U.S. carriers could face them. In truth, 3 would be waiting at Midway. The commander chosen to lead the carrier strike force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had his own doubts. A career torpedo officer, he had been promoted to lead the First Air Fleet more due to seniority than aviation expertise. At Pearl Harbor, his hesitation had cost Japan a third strike. Now he was being asked to carry out an even more complicated operation with a tired and depleted force. His carriers had been at sea constantly since December, operating from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. His pilots were exhausted, his ships overdue for maintenance. Worse, 2 of Japan's frontline carriers would not be available. The Shokaku had been badly damaged at Coral Sea and needed repairs, while Zuikaku had lost so many planes and trained pilots she could not take part. Out of Japan's 6 best carriers, only 4 would fight at Midway. Nagumo confided to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, "We are being asked to do too much with too little. The Americans have had time to prepare. Our pilots are tired, and we don't even know where their carriers are." Yamamoto is gambling with the fate of the empire. The greatest weakness in Japan's Midway plan was not ships, planes, or pilots. It was intelligence and mindset. The Japanese did not realize that their naval code, JN-25B, had already been broken by the Americans. At Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been decoding Japanese messages since early 1942. By the time Operation MI was underway, the Americans knew exactly what Japan planned. They had even confirmed Midway was the target through the famous AF ruse. Midway sent a secure cable claiming its water supply was failing. Soon after, intercepted Japanese transmissions reported that AF was short of water. That confirmed beyond doubt that Midway was the objective. The Americans also had a clear idea of when the attack would come. Admiral Chester Nimitz now held a priceless advantage. He had the full Japanese order of battle in hand and could place his forces exactly where they needed to be. The submarine picket line Japan sent out to watch for American ships leaving Pearl Harbor arrived too late. By then, U.S. carriers had already slipped through. Aerial reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, codenamed Operation K, was also canceled. The submarine I-123 had discovered that American warships USS Thornton and USS Peleus were anchored at French frigate shoals, the planned refueling site for Japan's long-range Kawanishi H-8K flying boats. That location had worked in March, when 2 H-8Ks had bombed Oahu after refueling there. But this time, Nimitz had blocked the attempt. One by one, every eye that might have warned Japan of the coming ambush was closed. There were signals suggesting trouble. Radio intelligence pointed to heavier American submarine patrols and increased message traffic near Midway. The ease with which U.S. forces had located Japanese ships at the Coral Sea hinted that their codes might not be secure. But such warnings were brushed aside. As one Japanese officer said confidently, "The Americans are too stupid to break our codes and too cowardly to fight without overwhelming numbers. They will only come to Midway after we have captured it. Then we will destroy them." On May 27th, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force, out of the inland sea. 4 carriers sailed: Akagi, Red Castle, Yamamoto's former flagship and now Nagumo's command ship; Kaga, Increased Joy, a converted battleship; Hiryu, Flying Dragon; and Soryu, Green Dragon. Together they carried 248 aircraft, 201 assigned for the strike on Midway and 225 fully ready for combat. On board were the most skilled naval aviators in the world, the same men who had devastated Pearl Harbor and struck across the Pacific from Hawaii to Ceylon. Japan believed nothing could stop them. Commander Minoru Genda, still weak from a recent emergency appendectomy, served as Nagumo's air operations officer despite his illness. In his diary, he wrote before departure, "We sail with heavy hearts. This operation is rushed. Our intelligence is poor and the plan is too complex. But we are samurai. We will do our duty, even if it means death. May the gods protect Japan, for I fear we sail toward catastrophe." Overconfidence showed itself again with Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the veteran aviator who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. In late May, Fuchida also suffered an appendectomy aboard Akagi. His weakened state kept him from flying, depriving Japan of its most experienced strike leader at the critical moment. Later he recalled from his sickbed that he felt the entire operation carried a sense of doom. Though modern historians caution that parts of Fuchida's post-war accounts may not be fully reliable, his absence during the battle was undeniable. In the pre-dawn of June 3rd, 600 miles north in the Aleutians, Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta opened the diversionary attack. His 2 light carriers, Ryujo and Junyo, launched strikes on Dutch Harbor in Alaska. The plan was to lure U.S. forces north while Nagumo struck Midway. But the deception failed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, thanks to his codebreakers, knew the true target and kept his carriers in position near Midway. The elaborate ruse only fooled the Japanese. Nagumo's carriers, meanwhile, pressed on through fog and strict radio silence. This would prevent any coordination with the distant Aleutian force. On board, pilots studied their final briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, assigned to lead the first strike, reviewed weeks-old reconnaissance photos of Midway. The images showed the airfield, fuel tanks, and defenses, but not the recent reinforcements or the newly installed radar that would soon detect the Japanese strike while it was still 93 miles away. That same evening, American PBY Catalina patrol planes spotted parts of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. Navy pilot Ensign Jack Reed radioed the first sighting at 0925. Sighted main body bearing 262, distance 700. The report electrified U.S. commanders. Yet Nagumo's carriers, hidden by weather and distance, remained undiscovered. On Akagi's bridge, tension grew. Chief of Staff Ryunosuke Kusaka warned Nagumo, "Sir, if the Americans have seen the invasion force, they may be more alert than we expected." Nagumo dismissed the concern. The invasion fleet, he argued, was meant to be visible. It would draw the enemy out. Tomorrow, he promised, Midway's air power would be destroyed. Then when the American carriers appeared to counterattack, Japan would annihilate them. But Nagumo did not realize that 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise was already tracking his position. Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17, with Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's hastily repaired Yorktown, had reached their rendezvous point, Point Luck, without being detected. The American carriers were exactly where Japanese planners had believed they would never be, already at sea, already in position, and already preparing to strike. At 0430 on June 4th, Akagi and Kaga launched the first wave against Midway. The takeoff went smoothly. 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters lifted into the morning sky. Lieutenant Tominaga led the group southeast toward Midway, 240 miles away. As the 108 aircraft formed up and departed, Nagumo made his first critical choice of the day. Instead of launching a full deck strike as doctrine advised, he held back another 108 aircraft, B-5Ns armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800 keeled-on armor-piercing bombs, reserved in case American ships appeared. At the time, it seemed cautious. It would later prove disastrous. Below decks on Akagi, Commander Fuchida watched from his sickbed. His absence from the operation would leave Japan without its most experienced tactician during the decisive hours ahead. At 0500, Nagumo ordered his reconnaissance planes into the air, just 7 aircraft tasked with scanning a vast ocean. By comparison, the Americans had deployed more than 30 PBY Catalinas to sweep the seas. One of the Japanese search planes, launched from the cruiser Tone, was assigned to scout the very sector where the American carriers were hidden. But the plane, Scout Number 4, took off 30 minutes late due to catapult troubles, possibly also mechanical delays. That single half-hour delay would ripple forward, shaping the outcome of the battle. The Americans had already broken Japan's naval code. JN-25B. Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been reading Japanese traffic since early 1942. By the time Operation MI was underway, U.S. cryptographers knew Midway was the target. The famous AF ruse confirmed it. Midway sent a coded message reporting a water shortage. Japanese intercepts then mentioned AF lacked water, proof the island was the objective. Washington also knew the likely date. Admiral Chester Nimitz had the Japanese order of battle and could place his forces to meet it. Japanese picket submarines sent to watch for American carriers arrived too late. The U.S. carriers had already slipped out. Operation K, the planned refueling and reconnaissance by Kawanishi H-8K flying boats at French frigate shoals, was aborted when Japanese submarine I-123 found U.S. warships. The intended refueling point was occupied. That same shoal had worked in March when 2 H-8Ks refueled from subs to bomb Oahu, but the Americans had learned and blocked the repeat. One by one, the Japanese eyes that might have warned them were closed. There were warning signs. Increased American submarine patrols and message traffic near Midway. The ease with which U.S. forces had found Japanese ships at the Coral Sea suggested codes were compromised. Those warnings were dismissed. As one officer arrogantly said, "The Americans are too stupid to break our codes and too cowardly to fight without overwhelming superiority. They will only come to Midway after we capture it, and then we will destroy them." On May 27th, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took the Kido Butai out of the inland sea. 4 carriers sailed: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Between them they carried 248 aircraft, 211 slated for Midway and 225 ready for combat, and some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These forces had struck Pearl Harbor and then pushed across the Pacific. Japan believed nothing could stop them. Commander Minoru Genda, still recovering from an emergency appendectomy, continued as Nagumo's air operations officer. He left a final diary entry before sailing: "We sail with heavy hearts. This operation is rushed. Our intelligence is poor and the plan is too complex. But we are samurai. We will do our duty even if it leads to death. May the gods protect Japan, for I fear we sail toward catastrophe." Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor strike, also fell ill and underwent an appendectomy aboard Akagi in late May. He was too weak to fly and watched preparations from his sickbed, disturbed by the operation's atmosphere. Later historians cautioned parts of his post-war testimony, but his absence at a crucial moment was real. In the pre-dawn of June 3rd, 600 miles to the north, the Aleutian diversion began. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's light carriers Ryujo and Junyo struck Dutch Harbor to draw U.S. attention north. The diversion fooled only the Japanese. Admiral Nimitz, informed by codebreakers, kept his carriers near Midway. Nagumo's force steamed on through fog and strict radio silence, which prevented effective coordination with the Aleutian group. Pilots aboard Nagumo's carriers reviewed their briefings. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, slated to lead the first strike, studied reconnaissance photos of Midway that were already weeks old. The pictures showed the airfield, fuel tanks, and defenses, but not recent reinforcements and, crucially, not the new radar station that would detect the Japanese strike at 93 miles out. That evening, American PBY Catalinas spotted parts of the invasion fleet about 700 miles west of Midway. Ensign Jack Reed radioed at 0925. Sighted main body bearing 262, distance 700. The report electrified U.S. command. Nagumo's carriers remained hidden by weather and distance. On Akagi's bridge, Chief of Staff Ryunosuke Kusaka warned Nagumo, "If the Americans have seen the invasion force, they may be more alert than we expected." Nagumo replied that the invasion force was meant to be seen, it would draw the enemy out, and confidently expected to destroy Midway's air power and then annihilate any carriers that came to defend it. 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard USS Enterprise was already estimating Nagumo's probable position. Task Force 16, with Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, had reached their rendezvous at Point Luck undetected. The American carriers were where the Japanese did not expect them, at sea in position preparing to strike. At 0430 on June 4th, Akagi and Kaga launched their first wave against Midway. 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate level bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M Zero fighters lifted off under Lieutenant Tomonaga's lead and headed southeast toward Midway, 240 miles away. As the 108 aircraft formed and departed, Nagumo made his first fateful decision. He held back the other 108 aircraft on deck, armed with Type 91 torpedoes and 800 Kilogis armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. It seemed prudent. It would prove catastrophic. Below decks on Akagi, Commander Fuchida watched from his sickbed. His absence removed a seasoned tactical mind at a critical hour. At 0500, Nagumo launched his reconnaissance planes, only 7 aircraft to scan an enormous stretch of ocean. The Americans had over 30 PBYs searching. Most critically, the Scout, plane assigned from the heavy cruiser Tone to look in the sector where the American carriers actually were, Scout number 4, launched 30 minutes late because of catapult trouble, perhaps engine issues or delays. That single half hour would ripple forward with disastrous effect. Ironically, modern study suggests that had that Tone plane launched on time, its search pattern might still have missed the U.S. carriers. At 0534, though, a U.S. PBY piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80 sighted the Japanese carriers and transmitted the terse message, "Enemy carriers." He followed with fuller information at 55 Fondu, 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135 degrees, speed 25 knots. On Enterprise, Admiral Spruance made a bold choice that shaped the battle. Despite the extreme range, nearly 200 miles, he ordered an immediate strike. The planes would have only just enough fuel to return, but he wanted to hit the Japanese while they were most vulnerable, recovering from their Midway strike. At 553, Midway's radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike at 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Every available aircraft scrambled, bombers to attack the fleet, fighters to defend. Marine fighters took off. 20 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats, badly outnumbered and outclassed by the escorting Zeros. The interception came at 0616. Major Floyd B. Parks led the defenders and radioed his last message. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. The result was swift and brutal. The Zeros, superior in maneuverability and flown by veteran pilots, tore through the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were shot down and 4 were badly damaged. Major Parks was among the dead. Japanese losses were minimal. 3 Zeros lost. At 0630, Tomonaga's strike reached Midway. Dive bombers and level bombers hit with accuracy, igniting fuel tanks, destroying structures, and cratering the runway. But as Tomonaga circled to assess results, he saw planes still taking off. The runway, though damaged, remained usable. Most important, the American aircraft had launched before the strike arrived, and were not caught on the ground. At 0700, Tomonaga radioed Nagumo requesting a second attack wave. That message reached Nagumo just as the first American strikes from Midway began to arrive. 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders attacked, carrying torpedoes. Zeros scrambled to intercept. 5 Avengers were shot down and 2 B-26s were destroyed. One B-26, nicknamed Susie Q and piloted by Lieutenant James H. Murray, made a desperate torpedo run at Akagi. Multiple Japanese witnesses later reported the bomber flew along Akagi's flight deck, its gunners strafing and killing 2 sailors, then pulled up at the last moment, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff had ducked for cover. Murray's plane returned to Midway with over 500 bullet holes and lost hydraulics. A second B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays and heavily damaged, crashed into the sea near Akagi's bridge, possibly a deliberate ramming attempt. The near miss had a powerful psychological effect on the Japanese. As Captain Kusaka later recalled, the Admiral was visibly shaken. It felt like a warning from the gods. More American attacks followed in quick succession. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMS B-241 led by Major Lofton R. Henderson, who would die leading the mission, high-altitude B-17s and other strikes. Most attacks were beaten back with heavy losses and no hits, but they forced Nagumo's carriers into evasive action, disrupting flight operations. At 07:15, Nagumo faced the critical choice. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes and 800 kilos armor-piercing bombs for ship attacks. Tominaga needed support at Midway, and no enemy carriers had yet been sighted. After a tense staff debate, Nagumo ordered a rearming, remove torpedoes and load land attack bombs. This defied Yamamoto's explicit requirement to remain ready for ship-to-ship combat. Below in the hangars, chaos followed. Ordnance crews began the slow, dangerous task of removing Type 91 torpedoes and 800 kilos armor-piercing bombs and replacing them with smaller land bombs. Time was short. Torpedoes and heavy bombs were stacked on hangar decks instead of being stowed in magazines far below. There wasn't time to follow proper procedure. Fuel hoses lay across decks as aircraft were refueled. One surviving mechanic would later say the hangar deck looked like a bomb factory. One spark, and we would all be dead. At 07:28, the delayed Tone Scout finally radioed, sighted what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing Dirotendig, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 deg, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately requested ship identification. No clear reply came for 12 agonizing minutes. The rearming continued. The hangars grew more cluttered with ordnance. At 07:45, another American strike reached the carriers. 16 Marine dive bombers from VMS B-241 led by Major Henderson. Zeros tore into them, shooting down 8, but the attacks continued, forcing violent maneuvering that made flight operations nearly impossible. Nagumo was trapped. His fighters were low on fuel and ammo from continuous combat. Tominaga's strike would soon return, low on fuel. Decks were cluttered with planes in various states of arming. Somewhere beyond the horizon were American surface ships, possibly carriers. At 08:09, Tone Scout No. 4 finally clarified its sighting. The enemy force consisted of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo breathed temporary relief and continued rearming for a second Midway strike. Then at 08:20, another message shattered that relief. The enemy force appeared to be accompanied by a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi of Hiryu signaled Nagumo at 08:30. It is advisable to launch attack force immediately. Aggressive and decisive, Yamaguchi saw the danger. Every minute of delay increased exposure. Nagumo hesitated. Aircraft on deck were mixed. Some armed with bombs for land attack, some still with torpedoes, many unarmed. Fighters needed to land and refuel. Tominaga's returning strike was inbound. Launching immediately would produce a partial, uncoordinated strike without adequate fighter escort, violating all principles of Japanese carrier doctrine. Commander Minoru Genda, still ill from his appendectomies, was consulted. According to staff testimonies, he urged an immediate launch. Speed was everything now. Admiral Nagumo hesitated. Some of his staff urged immediate action. Launch what we have. But Chief of Staff Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka pushed back. His warning was blunt. If they struck in scattered waves, losses would be heavy and the result minimal. Kusaka argued for patience. Recover the Midway strike group, rearm, refuel, and launch a full coordinated attack according to doctrine. Nagumo, known for caution and discipline, sided with Kusaka. The order went out. After Tomonaga's force returned, the carriers would rearm and then move north to engage the Americans with full strength. On paper, it was sensible. In reality, it was a disaster. At Iro 837, Lieutenant Chuichi Tomonaga's planes began landing. They were struck below to refuel and rearm, filling the hangars with fuel hoses, bombs, and torpedoes. Elevators cycled constantly, moving aircraft up and down. Safety rules were abandoned in the rush. The hangar decks became death traps, stacked with ordnance, volatile fuel everywhere, and no time for proper precautions. At 0920, the first U.S. carrier planes appeared. Hornets Torpedo Squadron 8, 15 TBD Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, came in low over the waves. They had no fighter escort, their aircraft outdated, barely managing 100 knots. Still, they pressed straight toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese Zeros, weary from earlier battles, finally had vulnerable targets in their sights. They dived like predators on prey. The result was carnage. All 15 Devastators were destroyed. Of the 30 men who launched, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who would cling to a seat cushion in the sea and witness the rest of the battle unfold. Not one torpedo hit, yet Waldron's squadron had drawn every Zero down to sea level. At 0954, Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6, 14 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, attacked. 10 were shot down, only 4 made it out, with no hits scored. At 10:12, Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 followed under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. Again, Zeros tore through them, destroying 10 planes. Still no hits. In total, 41 Devastators attacked. Only 6 returned. To the Japanese, it looked like victory. On Akagi's bridge there was relief, even celebration. Nagumo ordered preparations to launch his strike at 10:30. It seemed the Americans had been crushed, but high above, unseen, the real blow was forming. Every Zero was tied up at sea level. At 10:20, lookouts on Akagi shouted, "Enemy dive bombers!" From 14,500 feet, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had arrived. McCluskey had gambled, extending his search until he spotted the destroyer Arashi racing north after attacking the submarine USS Nautilus. Following Arashi led him straight to Nagumo's fleet. At the same time, 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie closed in from another direction. The timing was perfect. With decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, bombs and torpedoes scattered in hangars, and Zeros far below, the carriers were defenseless. At 10:22, McCluskey led his dive on Kaga. 4 bombs struck. The first 1,000-pounder exploded near the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and much of his staff instantly. A second bomb smashed into the midsection, igniting refueled planes. 2 more followed, turning Kaga into a blazing wreck. Lieutenant Richard Best took his division against Akagi. His bomb, a single 1,000-pounder dropped at 10:24, penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar among 18 fueled aircraft. The blast touched off torpedoes and bombs stored improperly. Within minutes, the ship was consumed by flames, the hangar a firestorm. At 10:25, Leslie's Yorktown group hit Soryu. 3 direct hits ripped through her hangars. Aircraft, bombs, and torpedoes erupted in secondary explosions. Flames engulfed the carrier. Captain Ryusaku Yamamoto refused evacuation, reportedly seen on the bridge with sword in hand, singing the national anthem Kimigayo as the ship burned around him. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were mortally struck. Only Hiryu, screened by distance and clouds, survived. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, wasted no time. At 10:58, as the other carriers burned, he launched a counterstrike. 18 Val dive bombers with 6 Zero escorts led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. At 1200, they found Yorktown. Despite fierce defense by wildcats and heavy anti-aircraft fire, 3 bombs hit. Yorktown was left burning and dead in the water. Yet her crew fought back. Damage control was swift and disciplined. Incredibly, within 2 hours, Yorktown was steaming again at 20 knots. Yamaguchi pressed the attack. At 13:31, only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros remained. Tominaga himself led them, despite flying a crippled aircraft with only 1 fuel tank operational from damage earlier. Offered a replacement, he refused. Every plane was needed. He knew it was a one-way mission. At 14:30, Tominaga's group located Yorktown, now making 19 knots after extraordinary repairs. American fighters struck hard, but Tominaga held his run even as flames spread over his plane. Witnesses reported he kept straight until the last second, releasing his torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown at 14:45, ripping open her port side and causing a 26-degree list. This time the damage was fatal. At 1700, Enterprise dive bombers found Hiryu. The last Japanese carrier would now face the same fate as her sisters. At 1703, Admiral Yamaguchi gathered his men on the slanting deck of Hiryu. Survivors later recalled that he apologized for the loss, urged them to live on and help rebuild a stronger navy, and then returned to the bridge with Captain Tomeo Kaku. Both officers chose to remain aboard. Their bodies were never found. Yamaguchi's last message to Admiral Nagumo included an apology for failure and a wish for the Emperor's success in war. Afterward, he was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Through the night of June 4th into June 5th, the remaining Japanese carriers fought to stay afloat. The effort was hopeless. Soryu sank at 1913 on June 4th, taking 701 men with her. Kaga went under at 1925 with 801 sailors lost. At Euro 200 on June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto, still 600 miles away aboard his flagship Yamato with the main fleet that had never entered the fight, finally accepted reality. He signaled, "Occupation of Midway is cancelled. Withdraw." Akagi resisted longer than expected. Despite uncontrollable fires, she remained afloat into the early hours of June 5th. At a 500 after survivors were evacuated, Japanese destroyers launched 4 torpedoes into her. She finally sank, taking 267 men. Hiryu also refused to go down quickly. After burning all night, she was scuttled at 05:10. She sank with 392 men and both of her admirals. By sunrise on June 5th, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, resting in more than 17,000 feet of water. In total, 3,057 men were dead. Of these, 2,181 died on the 4 carriers. Akagi lost 267, Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, and Soryu 711. Another 792 were lost aboard heavy cruisers. Mikuma was sunk with 700 dead, while Mogami was badly damaged with 92 killed after the 2 collided during night maneuvers and were later hit by American airstrikes. Surprisingly, only 110 of the dead were aircrew. Most pilots had been rescued. The real irreplaceable loss was over 700 highly trained mechanics and flight deck personnel, men whose skills had taken years to develop. Survivors pulled aboard destroyers were quickly kept apart from the rest of the fleet. They were locked below decks and forbidden from speaking to anyone to keep the scale of the disaster hidden. The defeat was not over yet. On June 6th, submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, slipped past the American destroyer screen at just 3 knots. Tanabe had been stationed off Midway providing weather reports and had watched earlier air attacks through his periscope. Now at 13:31, he fired 4 torpedoes from White 200 yards. 2 hit Yorktown. Another struck the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside providing power. Hammond split in 2 and went down in 4 minutes, killing 80 men, many from her own depth charges exploding as she sank. Yorktown, struck by 2 more torpedoes, refused to sink right away. She finally rolled over and slipped beneath the waves at 07:01 on June 7th, settling in 16,650 feet of water. For Japan, the sinking was little comfort. The loss of Yorktown did nothing to offset the destruction of their own carrier fleet. Meanwhile, Mogami and Mikuma, damaged in their collision, had attempted to continue operations. On June 6th, American aircraft found them. Mikuma was sunk with 700 sailors, the single largest death toll on any Japanese ship at Midway. Mogami, with 92 dead, barely limped back to Truk. The retreat was marked by shame and silence. Wounded men from the carriers were locked in special compartments, forbidden to talk about what had happened. When the fleet finally reached Japan on June 14th, it arrived at Hashirajima under cover of night to avoid public attention. The wounded were unloaded in secrecy, moved to hidden naval hospitals, and cut off even from their families. Survivors of the carrier air groups were quickly reassigned to bases in the South Pacific, without being allowed home. Most of them would later die in the Solomon Islands campaign. Crews from the sunken carriers were scattered across different ships, all sworn to silence under threat of severe punishment. The cover-up began immediately. Official propaganda maintained the illusion of victory. The lost carriers Akagi and Hiryu remained listed on the Navy roster as unmanned, preserving the false claim they were still operational. No senior officers were punished or court-martialed, since doing so would have forced public acknowledgement of defeat. Even the Japanese army was kept uninformed for nearly a month. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo himself was not told the full scale of the disaster right away. On June 5th, while the carriers were still burning, Tokyo Radio announced that Japan had inflicted heavy losses on the American fleet in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts went further, boasting of another great victory, even claiming 2 American carriers had been sunk. Only as an afterthought did they admit the loss of Kaga, and Soryu was mentioned later. The destruction of Akagi and Hiryu would not be admitted until after the war. On the home front, Japanese civilians filled the streets in celebration, unaware they were cheering a devastating defeat. It wasn't until June 10th that newspapers cautiously mentioned difficulties in the operation, still insisting Japan had won overall. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering in the hospital after his appendix surgery and burns suffered aboard Akagi, was visited by a naval intelligence officer who warned him, "You are forbidden to speak of what happened. As far as the world knows, we won a great victory." According to his later writings, Fuchida responded bitterly about the futility of building a war on lies, though historians caution this account cannot be independently confirmed. Admiral Yamamoto himself withdrew into isolation aboard Yamato. For 3 days he did not appear, while his staff reported hearing him pacing his cabin at night. In his diary discovered after the war, he admitted to deep despair, realizing that Japan could no longer win. His earlier warning to Prime Minister Konoe had come true. Japan had indeed advanced unchecked for 6 months, just as he predicted. Now, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned at Midway. In a private staff meeting recorded by Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto was blunt. "I gambled and lost. In trying to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own. The war is not yet lost, but I fear I have lost the means to win it." Later, in a letter to his close friend Rear Admiral Teichi, Yamamoto admitted that Midway was not the result of bad luck or overwhelming enemy strength. It was the product of Japan's own arrogance and flawed planning. They had underestimated the Americans and overestimated themselves. Japan now faced the cost of its overconfidence. Admiral Yamamoto had predicted that Japan had perhaps 18 months before the situation became hopeless. In reality, even that was too generous. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Marianas, and American B-29s would be bombing the home islands. The true loss at Midway was not only 4 carriers and 3,057 dead. Japan also lost more than 100 of its most experienced pilots, men who had trained for years, and fought in campaigns from China to the Indian Ocean. Their training program required at least 2 years to produce a combat-ready pilot and much longer to create a veteran, meaning they could not be replaced quickly. Even worse, over 700 skilled aircraft mechanics, armorers, and flight deck crew were killed. These men carried the practical knowledge of carrier operations, every detail of how to keep planes flying in combat. As Admiral Ugaki later wrote in his diary, "We can build new carriers in 2 years. We cannot build new pilots with the experience of those we lost, and we will never replace the maintenance crews who kept our aircraft flying." This was the real tragedy of Midway. The loss of people, not just ships. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. 2 years later, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, inexperienced Japanese pilots were slaughtered in what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 600 Japanese planes were destroyed while inflicting almost no damage. The roots of that disaster lay at Midway. Midway ended Japan's expansion. At Imperial General Headquarters, reality began to sink in. Planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii were abandoned. Operation FS, the proposed effort to cut American supply lines to Australia, was cancelled. From that point, Japan was forced into a defensive war it could not hope to win. For the Americans, the psychological effect was immense. Confidence soared, and they immediately began planning their counteroffensive. Just 2 months later, the battle for Guadalcanal would begin the long and bloody push toward Japan. The psychological collapse within the Japanese Navy was just as significant. The sense of invincibility that had lasted since Japan's victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905 was destroyed. Commander Tamichihara, a destroyer captain, later wrote, "After Midway, we never felt confident again. We went into battle expecting to lose. The Americans went in expecting to win. The whole psychology of the war had changed in those 5 minutes when our carriers were hit." Inside the Navy, blame and recriminations began immediately, though never in public. Admiral Nagumo, who had followed standard doctrine, was made a scapegoat. He was reassigned to shore duty and never commanded carriers again. In 1944, during the invasion of Saipan, he commanded ground forces and committed suicide rather than face capture. Admiral Ugaki wrote bluntly in his diary, "Nagumo is finished as a commander. The blame must fall on someone, and it cannot be Yamamoto." Midway also revealed deep flaws in Japan's military culture. Rigid thinking, blind adherence to doctrine, and an inability to adapt when circumstances changed all played a role in the defeat. These traits were recognized but not corrected, and they would contribute to repeated failures throughout the war. Post-war studies outlined the chain of mistakes. The Japanese plan was far too complex, with forces spread across thousands of miles and unable to support one another. Radio silence was enforced so strictly that coordination collapsed once things went wrong. Intelligence was disastrously poor. The Japanese had no idea that American carriers were already at sea, while the Americans knew every detail of Japanese plans thanks to code breaking. Reconnaissance was another critical failure. Only 7 Japanese search planes were sent to cover a massive area, compared to more than 30 American PBY Catalinas. The planned Operation K reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor was canceled because of American presence at French frigate shoals. The submarine cordon was established too late to detect the U.S. carriers. Even the cruiser-toned scout plane was launched half an hour late. Each individual failure might not have been fatal, but combined they guaranteed disaster. Overconfidence also played a part. Japan assumed its codes were secure. They were not. They assumed Yorktown was too damaged to fight again. She returned to service in just 72 hours. They assumed American pilots were inferior, but at Midway, U.S. dive bomber crews proved devastating. They assumed American carriers would arrive only after Midway was secured, but instead they were waiting in ambush. Damage control failures made the losses even worse. Japanese carriers had enclosed hangar decks and poor firefighting systems. When hit, they became death traps. American carriers, by contrast, had open hangars and far better damage control. Yorktown absorbed enormous punishment and might have survived if not for submarine torpedoes. Japanese carriers, with unsafe fuel systems and poor ammunition handling, burned out of control after even a single hit. Admiral Yamamoto himself did not survive much longer. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel schedule. P-38. Lightning fighters ambushed his plane over Bougainville and shot it down. His body was later found in the jungle, still strapped into his seat with his sword at his side. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor and Midway died with the knowledge that Japan had already lost the war. Before his death, Yamamoto expressed a painful clarity in one of his final letters to a friend. At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by spirit alone. They are won by intelligence, both good information and the wisdom to use it. We had neither. We were too proud to believe the Americans could be waiting for us, too rigid to change our plans, and too arrogant to imagine our codes were broken. Pride led to our fall, and our pride was without limit. The result was inevitable. The greatest irony of Midway was that Yamamoto had achieved exactly what he wanted, a decisive battle. But instead of Japan destroying the American carriers, it was the Japanese carriers that were destroyed. The very doctrine Japan had built its naval strategy on for 40 years proved correct. But it was the Americans, not the Japanese, who won that decisive battle. As preserved in Japanese military records, Admiral Yamamoto had long feared the power of American industry. In early 1942, he warned his staff, A soldier cannot boast of striking a sleeping enemy. The shame belongs to the one struck. Judge us after you see what the enemy does, for once angered he will surely launch a determined counterattack. At Midway, that counterattack arrived with deadly precision. The United States had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but managed to turn Japanese strategy back on itself. The war would continue for another 3 years, yet its outcome was essentially set during those 5 minutes on June 4, 1942. Beyond the strategic defeat, Midway was also a deeply human disaster. Roughly 325 miles northwest of Midway, 3,057 Japanese sailors and aviators lost their lives. Many were young men who had written farewell notes to their families that morning, shared bowls of rice and tea for breakfast, and still held dreams of returning home victorious. Instead, they perished in flames burning at 1,000 degrees, drowned in waters covered with oil, or were torn apart by blasts that echoed for miles. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the few who survived from Akagi's engine room, later gave testimony. He recalled, "The cries of the burning men still haunt me. We could not reach them. The corridors were blocked by fire. The ladders melted in the heat. We could only listen to their voices calling for their mothers, begging for water, or praying for death to end their suffering. I still hear them every night." Back in Japan, families were never told the truth. Instead, they received official notices claiming their sons had died honorably for the emperor in a great victory. Proud mothers placed gold stars in their windows, believing their sons had achieved something glorious, never knowing their sacrifice came in a crushing defeat that sealed Japan's fate. After the war, when the truth came out, it felt like a second betrayal. Some families refused to believe it at all. So deeply had the deception taken root. Petty Officer Tanaka, one of the few who escaped Soryu, remembered the morning before the attack. "We were full of confidence. We joked about which American ship we'd sink. Yamamoto bragged he'd sink a battleship. Suzuki swore he'd shoot down 5 American planes. They were both 18. They both died when the bombs hit. Their bodies were never found. Sometimes I wonder if they're still down there, waiting at their stations for orders that will never come." Today, the 4 Japanese carriers rest more than 17,000 feet below the sea. Their locations were only recently confirmed by Robert Ballard and other deep-sea missions. They are now war graves, silent monuments to the price of pride and the cost of war. Inside, the aircraft that once carried destruction across the Pacific remain twisted and broken in their hangars. The bones of the crews still rest at their posts, eternal guardians of ships that will never sail again. From Japan's point of view, Midway marked the collision of ambition with reality. It proved that courage and spiritual belief alone could not overcome material weakness. It showed that bravery without intelligence led to disaster, and that rigid thinking could not survive a changing battlefield. The battle broke more than ships and lives, it broke illusions. The long-held faith in Japan's invincibility, the belief that spiritual strength outweighed material strength, and the confidence that determination alone could overcome any odds, all sank with those carriers. What replaced them was a grim acceptance that Japan had started a war it could not possibly win, against an opponent it had badly underestimated, using outdated strategies that no longer worked. Yet out of that defeat, Japan eventually transformed. The same nation that once sought empire through conquest later renounced war, embraced democracy, and became a center for peace and progress. The same discipline that once built carriers now builds cars, computers, and technology. The spirit that once fueled expansion now drives innovation and prosperity. In that sense, the 357 men who died at Midway did not fall entirely in vain. The battle also stands as a cautionary tale for all nations. The Japanese Navy, despite its skill and bravery, fell victim to victory disease, the dangerous belief that past successes guarantee future ones. Commanders assumed the enemy would act as expected. They assumed their code was unbreakable. They assumed American carriers could not be repaired quickly. They assumed American pilots lacked skill. Each assumption proved wrong, and each contributed to disaster. The same fleet that had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with brilliance just 6 months earlier now failed at basic reconnaissance, ignored critical intelligence, and walked into a trap. Looking back at Midway through Japanese eyes, we see not villains but men caught in the machinery of war, young pilots who went to their deaths with courage, if not sound strategy, commanders forced to make decisions with partial knowledge, Sailors and mechanics working frantically to keep aircraft ready for battles they would never fight. Men who stayed at their posts to the end, even when the outcome was hopeless. Their story should be remembered not to glorify war or loss, but to highlight the true cost of militarism and the dangers of imperial ambition. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, whose role at Pearl Harbor is well known, later became a Christian evangelist after the war. While some of his later accounts are debated, his personal transformation, from the planner of Pearl Harbor to an advocate of peace, mirrored the journey of Japan itself, from empire to democracy, from isolation to global cooperation. The deeper lesson of Midway is clear. No nation can afford arrogance. No nation can ignore the realities of modern warfare. No nation can underestimate its enemies or overestimate its own strength. The carriers that once seemed untouchable at Pearl Harbor were fatally vulnerable at Midway. The pilots who once ruled the skies met their match in American dive bombers. The doctrines that once brought victory failed against a well-informed and united enemy. In the end, the waters that closed over the carriers at Midway symbolized the death of Japan's militarism. The young men who fought and died believed they were defending their emperor and empire. In reality, their sacrifice paved the way for a very different Japan, peaceful, democratic, and prosperous. Their loss, though strategically disastrous, revealed the futility of expansion by force and the impossibility of sustaining empire through war. This is Midway seen through Japanese eyes, a story of pride collapsing into defeat, of human errors piling into catastrophe, of young lives lost to miscalculation. It is not a story of glory but of tragedy, for in the end, the Pacific Ocean itself delivered the harshest lesson. Wars, no matter how decisive, bring only suffering. True strength is not found in conquest but in peace. The ghosts of Midway, Japanese and American alike, remind us that war leaves only loss. The waves that now wash over those sunken carriers carry with them not the voices of nations, but the shared human cost of conflict.